Good evening, everybody. My name is Timothy Gager, and welcome to Virtual Thursday's Dire Literary Series. And tonight, my guest is Dr. Dannagal Young. And let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Young. If I can just share the screen. You see, this sharing the screen was like so cool in 2022. It's so 2022, let me tell you. But this is right from our website. And just a little paraphrasing, because you folks can all go here yourself. Dannagal Young, Ph.D., University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication, is a professor of communications and political science at the University of Delaware, where she studies the content, audience, and effects of non-traditional political information. She's published over 60 academic articles and book chapters on the content, psychology and the effects of political information, satire, and misinformation. Her book, Irony and Outrage, A Polarized Landscape of Rage, Fear, and Laughter in the U.S., examines satire and outrage as the logical extensions of respective psychological profiles of liberals and conservatives. Her current book, Wrong, and maybe it should be Wrong, How Media, Politics, and Identity Drive Our Appetite for Misinformation. And that came out this month. So hopefully when you watch this and you hear her read and hear her answer the questions, you'll go out and purchase it. So let me turn it over to Dr. Dannagal Young.
Great. Thank you so much, Timothy. So you mentioned like a 10-minute read. I thought I'd give you a little context first. The way that this project came about, which I discuss in the prologue, is that in the early days of COVID, I was getting a lot of inquiries and seeing a lot of communications online where folks were really asking what is going on. And hey, look at this documentary, look at this article, look at this. Does this seem right? Does this seem plausible? And a lot of the things that were being shared were things that were empirically false or kind of conspiratorial. But these were people who were honestly trying to make sense of a very chaotic moment in our collective experience. And so in the prologue, I talk about that and how it reminded me of a moment in 2005 and 2006 when my late husband was suffering from a brain tumor, and the kind of conspiracy theory rabbit holes that I was inclined to go down early on in his diagnosis. And I started thinking about what it is that conspiracy theories can give people when they're in crisis. And the research points to the fact that when you believe in a conspiracy theory, you're usually assigning blame to powerful people in the shadows conspiring to either keep something from people or to benefit themselves. And as a result, conspiracy theories often result in anger on the part of the people who believe them. And anger, as much as we think of it as a negative emotion, anger has a direction to it. And because it has a direction to it, anger actually makes people feel a sense of optimism, which I know seems counterintuitive. But if you've ever felt fear or anxiety or depression, you know that they are demonstrably different from anger, because anger has a sort of a mobilizing dimension to it. So in that prologue, I also talk about what pulled me out of that rabbit hole. And ultimately, it was the sort of social norms of our community of friends and family that were antithetical to conspiracy theory beliefs. And so I've been working in the space of media psychology and political psychology for a long time, and thought what we need right now is a consideration of misinformation, not on the side of the study of misinformation content, because there's a lot of that, but on the side of our attraction to misinformation. What is it that causes people to want it? Because, put simply, if we didn't want it, it wouldn't exist. If there weren't a market for falsehoods, there wouldn't be so many. So that being said, I will now read you just a bit of chapter 1. The chapter 1 is called People Like Us Believe These Things. Here, just lest you think I'm lying, here it is, the actual book. Oh, and my favorite piece of this is that because I propose in the book, there's two pieces to it. It's the first half is about people, and the second half is about the process through which our media and political environment sort of exploits our social psychology. So at the very beginning, I have this interactive diagram that you can kind of turn back to understand how is it that this process works. It kind of reminds me of when I read Winnie the Pooh as a kid, and there's the map of the 100-acre wood at the very beginning that I always like to turn back to. So that is my hope for readers. So people like us believe these things. On the evening of January 6th, 2021, relaxing at her Washington, D.C. hotel in the aftermath of the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol building, rioter Jenny Cudd from Midland, Texas, recorded a video reflecting on her feelings about that day. F yes, I'm proud of my actions. I effing charged the Capitol today with patriots today. Hell yes, I am proud of my actions. So I'm going to skip forward a second. That just sets the stage for what it is we're talking about on the side of political wrongness. Meanwhile, long after the 2020 presidential election, a surprisingly large number of Americans continued to believe the big lie. A year into President Biden's first term, 1/3 of Americans reported the belief that Biden was not the legitimate winner of the 2020 election. Those numbers are consistent still today. Those numbers still hold. Among Republican respondents, 2/3 reported the belief that Biden's win was illegitimate. Again, that number is stable, still true today. When we talk about the people who believe misinformation about COVID and the people who believe misinformation about the 2020 election, in many cases, we are talking about the same people. Many of these misinformation beliefs hang together, even those that would seem to have little to do with each other. For example, vaccines containing microchips or dead people voting in Pennsylvania. Consider, for example, the quote-unquote health conference held in Nashville, Tennessee in 2021. Billed as a truth-seeking social event where people would discuss the truth about cancer vaccines and other aspects of natural health. Although described as a health conference, the gathering served as a place where conspiracy theorists and the conspiracy curious could come together to discuss everything from cancer to COVID to the 2020 election. And while the slate of speakers for the event included natural health advocates, it also included longtime Trump associate Roger Stone and Trump's son, Eric. As misinformation psychologist Lisa Fazio observed, it seemed that conference attendees were forming a community of belief. That is, people who think people like us believe these things. The overlap between belief in misinformation about COVID and belief in misinformation about the 2020 election highlights the very social nature of human knowledge. We do not come to knowledge of the world randomly or objectively. The things we know are not just accurate, neutral facts that we arbitrarily acquire from logic and analysis on the one hand, or even from observations of the world on the other. Rather, the things that we know or feel that we know are the result of a complex interaction between our values, theories, and beliefs in our head and the observations that we make of the world around us. These operate together in service of our social identity. That is our sense of what team we identify with. Social identities inform what we value and believe inside our minds. They also inform what we see, the observations we make of the world, by shaping our needs for comprehension, control, and community, what I call the 3 C's. Human beings are motivated to understand their world, that's comprehension, have agency within it, that's control, and be socially connected with a sense of belonging, and that is community. What shape these motivations take depends on what shape they take for members of our team. While the specific form that these 3 C's take will vary from person to person, among members of a shared social category, we will tend to find shared understanding. We'll tend to find shared mechanisms of control, and we'll tend to find shared social norms. This is because members of the same team come up with the same answers to questions like, how do people like me comprehend things like this? How do people like me control things like this? And how do people like me have community in times like this? The result is members of a shared social identity, sharing an understanding of the world, even if it might be wrong. In 2021, data scientist Jevin West and biologist Carl Bergstrom warned that misinformation has reached crisis proportions. It poses a risk to international security, interferes with democratic decision-making, endangers the well-being of the planet, and threatens public health. Scholars around the globe have been working to address the misinformation problem. They're testing the effectiveness of content moderation online, that is, flagging or removing misinformation across platforms. They're designing online interventions to slow users down, to have users think twice before believing or sharing questionable content. These scholars are also identifying promising fact-checking and belief-correcting techniques. They're mapping the ecology of the misinformation environment. They're identifying networks of people and organizations that spread misinformation. And all of these measures are necessary to reduce the spread of misinformation, especially given the complexity of the digital media landscape. But I would argue that focusing only or even primarily on the side of misinformation supply is not going to solve the problem of identity-driven wrongness. I would like this book to help turn the misinformation problem upside down, to offer what communication scholar Zeynep Tufekci describes as studying the people end of misinformation, or what I call the demand side of wrongness. In the US today, the all-encompassing nature of political identity overwhelms our desire to be empirically accurate in our understanding of the world. Instead of being motivated by accuracy, we're motivated by identity-based needs for comprehension, control, and community. I propose that we understand wrongness as a complex set of dynamics fueled by a political and media environment that draws on and actively constructs our social identities, thus leaving us with more culturally resonant and distilled political identities every day. Being wrong is about who we think we are, who we want to be, and who we want to be like. It's about how people like us comprehend the world, seek to control it, and find community within it. So remember when Jenny Cudd reported being proud of storming the Capitol on January 6th, how she talked about her actions that day. She said that she had effing charged the Capitol with patriots. Seeing the election as stolen allowed Ms. Cudd to comprehend how her team could possibly have lost. Believing that Vice President Pence could simply overturn the election results and declare President Trump the winner offered her and her team a sense of control. And as prominent in her mind as the false allegations of voter fraud was how she thought of herself as part of a community of effing patriots. And this is the essence of identity-driven wrongness. So I would love to hear thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to moderate a Q&A, and usually I start with a question, but we got a great question right off the bat from Chris. So Chris says, I'm not clear what you mean about misinformation and who defines what that is. For example, there's a long history in our country of our own government lying to us. Just in my lifetime, Vietnam, Watergate, Iran-Contra, lying us into a war in Afghanistan, lying us into a war in Iraq. And those who didn't agree with government narratives were ostracized and criticized, yet those who didn't agree turned out to be right. So I ask again, who defines what misinformation is, and aren't there dangers with that, as we've seen already?
Absolutely. In fact, so my colleague Joanne Miller, who is an expert in conspiracy theories at the University of Delaware, she has a wonderful line that she talks to students about, and she says, really, the people I think we should be most worried about are the people who don't believe any conspiracy theories, because of exactly what you're saying, because sometimes conspiracies are real. Often they exist. Sometimes government lies to us with catastrophic costs. So just to get to the viewer's question, the idea of what constitutes misinformation. As a sort of quantitative social scientist, when I am administering surveys to the public at a particular moment in time, I have to be able to label certain beliefs or pieces of knowledge as true or false, right? And the way that we identify truth, it's always flawed, right? How do we know what's truth? Truth is relative, truth is constructed, truth is social, is contingent. However, we have to be able to land on some notion that at the end of the day, there is some kind of empirical truth to the best of our ability. Otherwise, truly, without that, democracy cannot function. So when we're conducting surveys and we're trying to kind of code people as having belief in misinformation or not, how do we do that? Well, for example, with beliefs about COVID, when we asked, do you believe that the vaccine will implant you with a microchip or not? Okay, for example. So here's the definition that we draw from. And this there's wonderful work by Letitia Bodie and Emily Vraga and Brendan Nyhan and folks who look this stuff upside down and backwards. And they acknowledge all of the limitations you're talking about. And they say, we got to have a way to define it. So some define misinformation as information that is inconsistent with clear evidence and expert opinion, or information that contradicts expert consensus contemporaneous with a time period under study. What that means then, obviously there's a limitation here, because if it's contemporaneous with the time period under study, well then, if over time expert consensus evolves and more evidence is revealed, and it turns out, oh, I mean, heaven forbid, right? But there were microchips in those vaccines or something, right? Then the people who we coded as being misinformed in real time, perhaps at the end of the day, they had belief in truth, but we have to be able to code it in the moment under study. So, I got in a really cool debate with Mike Pesca, who hosts the Gist podcast, about this very thing, because he was like, that's a terrible definition. And I'm like, well, then how would you define it? How would you, if you're a social scientist and you're trying to code for belief in misinformation, how would you define it? Because all of these criticisms are fair, but at the end of the day, we need to be able to land somewhere.
Do you also believe that there is a crisis of the prevention of information? In other words, recently, I hate to just think automatically that it's Florida, but all the state workers got a raise, but all the university state workers did not intentionally, which I believe is kind of a prevention of information. Do you cover that at all in your book?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because as the book came out right around the time that those issues were starting to really become salient. The book was already sort of in press. And I'll tell you, between Jim Jordan's committee on the weaponization of the government, where, they're giving subpoenas to researchers, and places in Florida where there's a real crackdown on certain kinds of research, certain kinds of teaching, etc. One of the things that concerns me about this, and is quite ironic, is that in the call to avoid censorship, what some of these efforts are doing is limiting the production of knowledge, limiting our ability to acquire new evidence. And if there's anything that I think is a really devastating form of censorship, it is putting constraints on the production of knowledge. So you're absolutely right. I don't really deal with that too much in the book, but you are correct.
I mean, I think that if this broadcast here gets censored or removed, I'm on the right track. That's sort of the way I think about it. So there is a lot of questions coming in. So Joseph asks, what role does religious affiliation play in the, I guess in the belief of misinformation or the production? He doesn't really.
Oh, no, it does. You know what? That's such an excellent question. So I deal with the issue of religious faith in a couple of ways in the book. Because the book really centers on the role of social identity and how we want to comprehend, control, and have community based on our team identity. What that means is that the social construction of social identity becomes paramount. But what gets to define our social identity? Who defines what team we're on? How does that get shaped? How does that get primed in our mind? Well, in the US, over the last 40 years, our political parties have become quite socio-demographically distinct, including across lines of religion, ethnicity, race, culture, geography. So a lot of Democratic theorists are very concerned. You know, the concern for a long time was political polarization. You heard this talked about a lot. Now, political psychologists and political scientists are really worried about this social sorting of the parties, where the parties don't just stand for different ideas, but the parties contain different kinds of people along the lines of these primal categories that have to do with what we look like, who we worship, where we live, and how we live, and what we value, which is very problematic. And so to the question about religion, it plays a part in a couple of ways. Number one, the Republican Party, while the Democratic Party has become the party of sort of ethnic racial diversity, obviously ideological liberalism, folks tend to be in suburban and urban communities, and they're, did I say secular and agnostic? Maybe. In the Republican Party, you have the tendency for folks to fit into a really homogenous, aligned set of identities. And those are white, evangelical Christian, rural, and culturally conservative. So the role of evangelical Christianity plays a really interesting, well, it's just an interesting part of the story, because when you look at how folks come to understand their worlds, right? Like, all of us come to understand our worlds through different ways. Sometimes we use intuition and instinct, gut reactions. Sometimes we look to evidence and data. You know, we're looking to disconfirm, to see, should we disconfirm the things that we believe, etc. Well, there is some work from political science that suggests that for folks who are evangelical Christians, part of their epistemology, or their way of knowing, is rooted in faith, belief, value, instinct, which tends to be sort of an emotional response. There is a guiding set of principles. That is where belief is formed, which will tend to downplay disconfirming evidence or data. So there's a real concern then that part of what we see when we're looking at the reduction in trust in science on the right is a result of this sort of epistemology of evangelicalism a little bit. That's like, why I know truth because I feel truth, because I'm connected to God and I have my faith and it tells me what's true. So to the extent that an individual believes that their faith guides them to truth, they will tend to downweight or downplay the importance or relevance of disconfirming information or evidence that is brought to bear on those beliefs.
Right. So part of your book talks about how to reverse it. So my question is, you give a lot of credit here, the way you talk about the general population. I mean, you're using very, very strong intellectual language, but how do you reverse something like this when I think the people that put out misinformation know that the population is just a bunch of effing sheep?
Here's the deal, Tim. I am a tireless optimist, okay? I'm a political scientist. Most of my friends are very depressed, especially over the last several years. Democracy's in crisis. I would have jumped ship if I didn't think that there was a way out. And I do think that there's a way out. And the reason that I think that there's a way out is because there is such an appetite. When I start talking about these issues and solutions, people are like, how can we fix it? And if we really were on our way to hell in a handbasket, no one would give a shit. No one would ask, what can I do to fix it? Because they'd be like, we're screwed. And there are ways to fix it. And the solutions, because social identity and these political mega identities play such a disproportionate role in our culture or in our lives, my suggestion is that disrupting those is the ticket out. So finding ways to disrupt our own performances of identity, meaning if you kind of check all the boxes of someone who's on the left, but not all of your issue positions are super lefty liberal, chances are you're kind of quiet about the positions that don't really fit in that little column. Maybe you owe it to yourself and your friends and democracy to be forthright and say, hey, here's the deal. I know I look like all these things, but here are the way that my issue positions actually fall. Throwing a wrench in the works is so helpful. And that also means because issue positions themselves are not nearly as easily categorized as these big sort of socio-demographic categories, what people think on actual issues about the details of gun control, the details of abortion policy, they're very nuanced. People aren't just extreme left or extreme right. And so what that means is that we owe it to each other to always make a seat at the table, to always give the benefit of the doubt, to always be open to having a conversation. And the big one that I love is if we embrace the possibility that we might be wrong, what that does is it opens up our mind and our heart to the potential of disconfirming information that could change our view. And so the people who are the most willing to admit they might be wrong tend to be the most likely to be empirically right, which that gives me hope.
Right. So there's also a piece of it called follow the money in terms of presenting information. I think that I'm going to tie this into Robert's question. So where is the line now between news and opinion editorial?
Great question. Well, if you're watching Fox News, you can't really tell unless you do some research on how they categorize their programming, because all the shows look the same. But Fox is an interesting example, actually, because they have a really legitimate news organization that embraces professional norms of journalism and is wedded as much as it can be to empirical truth. What I think is fascinating is watching how their news organization really came head to head with their money-making shows, which are their opinion shows, during that Dominion voting systems lawsuit. Because their sort of news arm was trying to stay committed to empirical truth, was trying to not go down the sort of slippery slope of conspiracy theories. But when your brand of your partisan news outlet is based on identity threat, which is like what Fox's organization is for, I think you're really going to struggle. But to me, that is it. A true commitment to accuracy motivations and to always be willing to update and correct in a public way when anything that you have reported has been found to be empirically false.
The FCC used to control information, so it had to be presented fairly on both sides by each media outlet. And that was overturned during the Bush administration because there was money involved. So can we get back to balanced reporting by overthrowing that money line?
That's an interesting question. So what you're talking about is, the Fairness Doctrine, which was repealed in 1987. And fun fact, that's the year that Rush Limbaugh then made his show go national because he could, right? Because you don't have to do the both sides anymore. I think that would be a step in the right direction. I'm not sure, because of our fragmented media environment, where these teeny tiny outlets that cater to tiny homogenous groups of people, I'm not sure that the Fairness Doctrine makes sense anymore. And I think that that's kind of the argument behind its repeal in 87, because it was the era of cable, right?
Yes.
And it was like, well, cable is expanding. There's this fragmented media environment. Maybe we want to allow a station to just speak to the right or just speak to the left. So would it be good for democracy to have that back? Sure. I think that genie might be out of the bottle.
Chris is going back. His first question when he had the list of how the government had lied to us. Have you studied why people don't trust the government narratives? Just based on his incomplete list above, aren't there good reasons to be skeptical about our government, what our government tells us? Maybe being skeptical is healthy and necessary, question mark?
Yeah. So the question of how much distrust in government is healthy in a democratic society it's a wonderful question. I don't have the answer to that. I know that a healthy skepticism is very different from a distrusting cynicism. So I would say a distrusting cynicism is where you are convinced that the media, that the government only lies to you. And so therefore you discount everything they say and you no longer participate or make any effort to make it better. A healthy skepticism is, I'm not sure that I can trust everything that they say. And so I'm going to stay engaged. I'm going to vote, and I'm going to vote in ways that hopefully might make it more likely that people who I think are credible, people of integrity, will get into office. I think that's one way forward. When you combine a complete, here's kind of my litmus test, okay? And recall, I am a scientist, which means falsifiability is at the heart of everything I do. Falsifiability is, can I take a claim that I'm making and hold it up to some really severe test to try to break it, such that if that claim were false, it would be revealed to be false, right? Like that's what science is. That's what controlled studies are. It is, let's try to break the theory. So my question for folks who are very distrusting of government would be, what would you have to see to have trust? Is there anything that a person in a position of power could tell you that maybe is something you don't want to hear, or something you do want to hear, but that you would trust? And if the answer is nothing that any elected official could ever tell me will ever be true, I would suggest that's a non-falsifiable claim.
What happens if they try to tell you that they love you? Is that a truism or not?
I think that's probably campaigning, right? That's campaigning.
All right, so from a purely non-scientific, empirical way, so I'm going to ask you quickly your opinion, and I think we need theme music for this game show. What do you think has more influence on your phenomena, right? Yeah. People feeling they have an important voice on Twitter and social media, or people in the past that paved the way for misinformation, such as the debate around the Kennedy assassination, such around the debate about the flat Earth situation. So which do you think has more influence on the team polarization and the production of misinformation?
Am I allowed to choose an option C? I know that's annoying.
No, it's not annoying because you're the expert.
Okay, I'd say it's an option C, which is the conditions that created the engine for identity-driven wrongness. And those conditions include the sorting of the parties across socio-demographics, such that social identity drives us to want to believe things in accordance with our team, even if they're false, and the simultaneous shift in our media environment towards tiny niche outlets, and the economics of which are predicated on engagement, attention, outrage, mobilization. So that there's a synergy between the sort of primacy of social identity in American politics and the potential money that can be made and power that can be gained by exploiting social identity. If you are Facebook or Fox, MSNBC, or a politician that just wants to mobilize people. It's like a marriage.
It's I love how you use the word team, because people are really rooting for their team. It's like going to a Philadelphia sporting event and wearing a jersey of a different uniform.
It is.
You don't want to mess with that team. Holly has a question. How significant do you think the isolation COVID produced and the anxiety about surviving, at least in the early years, the early years,
the early years. How sad is that? The early years.
Increase the need for community.
Yeah. Holly, you are on point. I talk a little bit in the book about how COVID was this really awful accelerator of some of these dynamics, because social isolation is devastating for human beings, right? The whole book is about how we are social animals, which is why we will tend to believe what our team believes, even if there's a part of us that's like, that doesn't necessarily seem right. But we're far more likely historically to survive if we are sort of in keeping with our team than if we're off on our own believing something else. So social isolation contributed to those dynamics. What happened at the time is, because we didn't have those incidental interactions with people in our neighborhood, because we weren't really allowed to like go wander and chit chat about, we weren't seeing people at work, we weren't seeing people randomly at the grocery store. Think about how that changed our social interactions. Our social interactions were no longer incidental, they were deliberate. What does that mean? Well, maybe you're going to get together with friends on a Zoom, or maybe you're going to go into a Facebook group. A Facebook group based on what? Shared beliefs, shared interests. And so it creates this sort of homogenous social world that's super wacky, unlike what you would get in the real world. As you know, we tend to interact with folks that are kind of like us a little bit, but we also have these sort of, cursory interactions at the water cooler or whatever. During COVID, that was gone. Not to mention the fact that we were also experiencing existential threat and uncertainty. And if there's anything that makes people believe information that is false, it is existential threat and uncertainty, especially if the misinformation offers us an understanding of what the hell is going on, even if it's not true, offers us a sense that we have some control or agency, even if it's not true, or if it offers us community. And so think about the COVID misinformation, the idea, right? The COVID misinformation, like it's a hoax. Boy, that feels really good. The idea that COVID's a hoax, well, then I don't have to worry about anything. That's like the best kind of misinformation ever. It makes me feel hopeful and protected. Or the idea that masks make you sick, also untrue. But then you're like, oh, this uncomfortable, awful thing that makes me feel like I can't breathe and I can't express myself, it is actually not helping. Well, now I'm liberated. Now that makes me feel like I have control. So if you start to peel back the layers of the onions on the specific beliefs and misinformation, you realize the social isolation, stress and uncertainty, and existential threat, coupled with lies that made me feel like maybe it's not so bad and maybe I can just live my life like normal. It makes sense.
All right, we'll wrap it. I know we've kept you a little longer than I said. We'll wrap it up with a final question. Even if my brain is exploding with intellectual euphoria right now, because I'm just really enjoying this.
Good.
So Chris asks, do you have political biases, and how do they factor into your studies? And I'm going to add additionally, did you try to throw away any biases you have in the production of your book?
So my sense, I operate very differently from a lot of my social scientist friends. And that is, usually in science, you're like, I'm objective, I'm an outside observer, I'm looking in, I'm studying this thing. I kind of feel like that's bullshit, because I'm also a person, I'm a human, I'm studying biases and information processing, but I'm not special. I have them. I have all the biases. I engage in all these patterns that I'm studying. So I'm very forthcoming in my writing about what those beliefs are, how they operate. I mean, I'm a social scientist. I live in New Jersey, blue New Jersey. I I live in Camden County, which is like the Democratic machine of New Jersey. However, and as I say to folks too, my political identity, and part of why I study what I study, is because I'm married to the head of homicide in the prosecutor's office in Camden. So my political beliefs are constantly challenged by, especially in the realm of sort of criminal justice and crime and interpersonal threat, because in my world, interpersonal threat is like a fiction. You know, the biggest interpersonal threat I get is if somebody doesn't hold the door for me into the like lecture hall, right? So to have that proximity helps to disrupt some of those biases on a daily basis. I think it's really healthy for me. And I think it's something that folks should embrace and have in their lives to kind of keep them honest. As long as your value systems are compatible, right? But to have that is, I think, it keeps you intellectually humble.
All right. Well, Dr. Dannagal Young, that was a fantastic reading and talk. Here's the book, everybody. Wrong: How Media, Politics, and Identity Drive Our Appetite for Misinformation. It's a very important book. If you've heard today's show, and please buy it. And even though this is the Amazon site, you don't have to buy it from Amazon. Buy it wherever you want.
Wherever you want.
It's really, really, really important. And so folks that are watching the live stream are now disengage you, but you can use the link if you want to show up in the open mic. I will gladly let you in, and thanks for writing. And Dr. Young, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Tim, and go Blue Hens.
Yes.
All right. Thanks.